Hey everybody, how's it going? I'm Alex Schultz, and in this video I'm going to be talking to you about how we can train a AWS DeepRacer model on your local home computer as opposed to using the tools provided by AWS to train your models in the cloud. So real quick, if you're not familiar with AWS DeepRacer, you can go to the website at aws.amazon.com/deepracer and find out all kinds of information. There's a virtual league that's currently going on, and the prizes for competing in the league include winning an actual AWS DeepRacer car, or if you win first in any month leading up to reInvent, then you actually win a all expenses paid trip to reInvent. So you can certainly use the console to train. However, that's expensive and it costs a lot of money. So there's a huge financial incentive for people that want to do a lot of training and want to really experiment with this stuff to actually train locally on your home computer. And so this project really started after reInvent 2018 by a guy named Chris, and I don't know the whole history behind it, but essentially he has a repo out there that most people are referencing who are doing this, and it goes over everything that you would need to know about for actually setting up a full training environment on your home PC. And there's a whole bunch of pieces to this, and we're gonna cover them each one of the pieces. But basically, if you're interested in kind of understanding all the details and what goes on in the training process, then you should definitely check out Chris's repo because he covers a lot of stuff in there. What I've done is I've taken what Chris has built and I've essentially made it simpler in that you can download everything and then just run a simple script, get the entire environment set up, and then start training very quickly. So I'm going to show you how to do that today. So this is my repo here, and in order to get started with this, all you have to do is come down to this clone or download, copy this link here, and then we're going to open up a terminal. And I guess before we get started, I should mention there's a number of prerequisites before you start this. So one of the main things is go through this README and make sure that your environment matches, or that you understand what the prerequisites are. So for instance, I'm running Ubuntu 18.04. I've got an NVIDIA GPU, so I happen to have a 1080 Ti GPU installed on my computer. I've got all the CUDA libraries, all the CU, DNN, and libraries installed. All that's required to do this machine learning training. So if you don't have a GPU, you can certainly use a CPU, although you're going to see a lot of lag in the actual training process. So you want to make sure if you have a GPU and you can install Ubuntu, even if you have to dual boot or something, follow this README, go through these steps so that you can get started. If it's impossible, if you can't do that, what you could do is you could actually use an Amazon EC2 instance and set all this stuff up on an actual EC2, running in the cloud, and you could set this up, and it would be cheaper than if you ran it through the DeepRacer console itself. So you can certainly follow along with these steps, even if you don't have a GPU, but having a GPU helps. So, all right. So anyway, I'm not going to go through all these steps because they're all documented here. I'm not going to talk about installing CUDA and CUDNN because this video would take hours. So I'm just going to focus on getting set up for DeepRacer local training. So we're going to copy this URL. We're going to open it up in a terminal. And in this case, I'm just going to go ahead and do this on my desktop, but feel free to do it wherever you want on your computer. So we're going to run git clone, and then we're going to clone this repo. And there it is. We're just going to hop into there. And inside here, there is a init script. So really all you have to do is run this script here. Now, this is going to do a number of things. One thing it's going to do is it's going to download Chris's DeepRacer repo. It's going to actually download all that code. And then it's going to build a number of projects, or it's going to build a Docker container for RoboMaker, which is one of the dependencies that this project relies on. So this is going to take probably, depending on your network speed and your computer speed, probably 5 to 10 minutes or so. So I'm probably gonna pause the video here and just let it run, and then once this is done, we'll pick back up. But okay, so everything is finished running. Like I said, it downloaded a bunch of code. This actually downloads 2 repos. I misspoke earlier. This downloads Chris's repo, and it also downloads another repo, which is a fork of the AWS log analysis tools for DeepRacer. So it's basically a Jupyter Notebook server running that does a bunch of log analysis stuff, and we're going to cover that in a bit in this video. So anyway, it does that, and then it builds this container for RoboMaker, and that's it. So once this is up and running, you can cd into, there's a scripts directory in here, and pretty much everything you'll need to do in terms of controlling the workflow here is going to be in the scripts directory. So come in here, there's 3 separate directories inside there. There's a training, a log analysis, and evaluation subdirectory. So we're going to run into the training directory, and inside here, we're just going to go ahead and call start. And this is going to be a quick test just to make sure that everything gets, is working correctly. And so what this is doing is this is actually using Docker and Docker Compose to spin up the entire environment on your local machine. So, Docker is awesome. If you guys don't know, if you're not, familiar with Docker, definitely, something you should put on your to-do list of things to learn, because Docker makes everything easier in development. But anyway, it uses Docker Compose, and it also installs, it also brings up this this VNC viewer, which will show you the actual training process. So right now, my training setup, I have a really, really slow speed for this agent on here, and I'll show you how to actually adjust all those things. But this just proves everything's working. So you can see that the car is moving inside of this gazebo simulator here. You can control the vantage point or the viewpoint using this little orange dialog box up here. And so anyway, so we know this stuff is working. That's great. So what we can do is we can come back here and go ahead and call stop. And it's important that you use this stop command, because if you don't, there's actually things that are going to stay running. So back to what I was saying, we use Docker Compose to set up the entire environment. And that's going to bring up all of the necessary containers. So we have a RoboMaker container. This project also uses this Intel RL Coach framework, which is like the reinforcement learning training process. There's a RoboMaker actually dynamically spins up its own SageMaker container as well, which handles the model updates and stuff like that. And if you don't use the stop script, then what you'll end up with is containers that basically get orphaned during this process, because, like I said, RoboMaker spins up its own containers, which are not managed by Docker Compose. So if you're familiar with how Docker Compose works, normally when you call Docker Compose down, it'll basically tear down all the containers that you started with Docker Compose up. But because RoboMaker is starting its own containers, namely SageMaker, we have to go in and basically find that container, and then we kill it programmatically. So the stop script does all that for you. So if you just use these scripts, you'll be okay. So just to make sure we don't have anything else running, if we run Docker PS, notice we don't get anything listed. So there's no containers that are currently running still. There's a few other there's a few other scripts in here that we'll talk about here in just a bit. But what I want to do is I want to kind of walk you through the actual project itself. So let's go ahead and open up a window here that shows what we downloaded. So this is the repo, and it actually downloaded a lot of this content using InnoScript. The files that you're going to want to pay attention to. So these should be listed in the GitHub repo, but if you're confused about what some of that stuff means, or if you're new to a lot of the stuff with DeepRacer, you might not necessarily know like where to find this stuff. So this is a quick overview of where you can find stuff within this project. So this RL DeepRacer coach robomaker.py file, this is actually going to contain a lot of the information for actual training. So if you scroll down in here around line 97, there's this estimator object, and within here there's if you've played with the DeepRacer console, you may recognize that a lot of these are the hyperparameters that are available to adjust within the DeepRacer console. So for instance, batch size, number of epochs, the learning rate, things like that. So you can come in here and you can actually adjust these particular parameters and set them within this file. This is how you would do it if you're doing local training. So so you would set these, and then let's see, these are gonna come into play here in just a bit. But this is how you would set up, like if let's say you're using the DeepRacer console and you cloned a model and you wanted to start from that cloned model and then basically start pre-training or start training from that point, you would use these two parameters here, but we'll show that in just a bit. Okay, the next one you want to look at, the next file you want to look at is inside the Docker directory, and that's this .env file. And if this isn't showing and you're on Ubuntu, you can come up here and you can click this show hidden files. Because there's a dot in front of it, that's a hidden file. So come in here, open that up, and take a look at what's in here. So this is, if you're familiar with Docker Compose, this is just a file that gets basically passed in. These are all these environment variables that that'll get replaced within the actual Docker containers when they spin up. So some of the things in here that you want to pay attention to, this world name, this is actually the track that you're going to be using. So if you remember from before when we first ran that start script in the training directory, the AWS track was the first track that came up. So if we wanted to, we could pick a different track, and to see what tracks are available, you can come back up here into the DeepRacer for Dummies repo, and then go into, I believe it's in DeepRacer, and then I think it's in one of these. I always forget. Yes. Okay. So in this, if you guys followed me, you may have to pause the video and go back. But if you followed me, these are the names of the tracks that you can pick from. So, for instance, if we wanted to switch to the Trina track, then what we could do is we could grab that name, replace it in there, save the file, and then from within the scripts directory, if we run start again, what this is going to do is this is going to bring up our training environment, but instead of the AWS track, it's going to use the China track. So we'll wait for this to come up, and then we'll see RoboMaker, or Gazebo rather, and it's going to come up and it's going to show us the China track instead. So sure enough, here's Gazebo. And if we zoom out here a little bit, you can see that this is the China track from AWS. So that's how you would change tracks during your training. So we're going to go ahead and stop that again. Go back in here. Let's see, not that file. We want the, where did it go? Go back here into Docker env. Okay, so the world name is one that you can change. There's also, what other things would you want to mess with in here? I think that's the main variable that you would want to change in here. So if you want to change what track you're actually training with, so some people will train with the same track, and they'll basically just train their model on a single track. But if you want to avoid overfitting, then what you want to do is you want to basically change tracks periodically, so that way your model is not learning just the turns for a particular track. So we'll come up here, and this volumes directory, this is actually where all of the data is going to be stored on your local system. So this, if you're familiar with Docker, and if you're familiar with how Docker volumes work, then this is actually, these directories are actually mounted into the containers using Docker volumes. And so this Minio, this is actually basically like an S3 equivalent, where it handles, I believe the API is actually maybe identical to S3. But anyway, this is where all of the actual files go while you're training. And this RL DeepRacer SageMaker directory here, this is where after however many epochs, your model will basically go through, or iterations rather, your model will go through, and then it'll update the weights in the model, and it'll save that data here. And these are like basically the TensorFlow weight files that are going to get output to, in AWS, they'll get output to S3, but in here, because you're doing local training, they'll get output to this particular directory. So if you look at this directory while you're training, you're going to notice that it keeps adding more and more files as it adds additional model files. So just be aware that this is where all of the actual training output is going to go. Then in this custom files directory, this is where you actually have your reward function, which we open this up. The default that comes from Chris's repo is the default that comes from AWS. So if you want to modify your reward function, this is where you would do it. And so you could come in here and you could write whatever Python you want. And you can, of course, experiment with this. But this is where you would actually make all those changes to your reward function for your training. You have to do this before training starts. Once training starts, this all gets cached, and you can't change it. It won't update. So you have to stop the training, and then you can update this file. Also note that if there's any syntax errors in here, you won't know it until you try to start training, and then you start getting weird errors. So I've gotten a lot of like GitHub issues related to missing tabs, or tabs versus spaces, or people basically syntax errors in the reward function, and they didn't realize it because the errors are kind of buried a little bit. So it makes sense to make sure you run this through some kind of a linter, or make sure that you didn't make any mistakes in here before you actually try to start training, because this will cause a headache if you don't make sure that it's correct. All right, the next file in here is the model metadata, and this is actually your action space. So if you're not familiar with action space, go ahead and check out the AWS DeepRacer documentation, or you can just kind of experiment with training within the AWS console. But the action space is essentially the output layer of the model that the agent is going to use in order to determine the next action that it takes within an action, within a particular step. So this action space here has, notice it has, they're indexed. So you want to make sure that you when you change this, you're keeping the indexes in order. So you don't want to have like index 1 and then 6 and 7. You want to make sure that these stay in order. The angles are basically the steering angles. So -30, I don't know if that's left or right, but basically, it's the actual angle of the wheels on the car itself. And then the speed, of course, is I don't know if it's meters per second or whatever, but anyway, it's basically the speed of the car. So if you remember when we first ran start, the car was going really slow, and that's basically because the top speed that we have in here is 0.8, and that's pretty slow. So there's the people that are leading in the leaderboard, they're posting, or they're basically training with 10 or whatever, something like that. So you can come in here, you can adjust this. It's just JSON, so it's just basically a JSON object with an array of action spaces. So come in here, you can set this to whatever you want, and when you submit it to Amazon, it'll actually use this. So you could, in theory, have a speed of like 20. It's going to be wildly out of control, and it's probably not going to get a successful lap, but you're able to do it, and the evaluation process on Amazon will allow you to do it. I've seen people where they've actually had, the more left speeds, basically more action spaces or actions where their wheels are pointing left than they have right. So they're sort of basically like imbalanced in terms of the steering. There's some people that experiment with a really small action space. There's some people that get really granular with this. This is all part of the learning process. So experiment with the model metadata, and just, you're going to have to play with it, because this kind of goes hand in hand with all your hyperparameters and your reward function. So all those things together are going to dictate how your model does overall. So let's see. I think that's all I have to say about the metadata. Yeah, so edit these files. Like I said, you got to do it before training. One other thing I'll talk about the metadata is, once you've set the action space, you can, in between training runs, you can adjust this. But just be aware that when you first start training, the first round of training, SageMaker, I think SageMaker, is actually generating the machine learning model. And depending on how many actions you have in your action space, that's what's actually determining the output layer of your model. So you can't add an extra action to your action space after you've already started with a particular model, because it just won't work. Your output layer is not going to match to whatever you set in your action space. What you can do, and what I've seen people do, and I've had success with too, is you can adjust the speeds in between training runs. And when I say in between training runs, if you're familiar with the Amazon console, you can stop training, you can clone your model, and you can start from that point. You can adjust the speeds when you're doing local training, but you can't do it in the console, but you can do it through this file, this metadata file. Now, what you probably don't want to do is you probably don't want to adjust the steering angles, because that's going to really throw off your model. Maybe you'll have better luck with it than I did, but what I've noticed is you could train the model to get around the lap, or get around the circuit using slower speeds, and then you can gradually start to increase the speeds in your action space, and then you'll start to see improvements. It's going to have to go through another learning phase where, once you increase the speed, it basically has to relearn how to get around the lap, or how to get around the circuit. But once it's done at once, once you're getting around making laps consecutively, usually if you increase the speed by a little bit each training run, then it'll adjust, and it'll start to accommodate for the increase in speeds. So you can basically increase these speeds a little bit, and you'll probably have pretty good results up until a point. If you go too fast, then the car is just going to start spinning off the track, and it's not going to work. But you can increase it to a point, and you should have some success with that. So just a little pro tip there. Okay, so back into volumes. So there's this robo directory as well. And inside here, there's a checkpoint directory. And this is where all of a lot of the snapshot files are going to go. You don't need to do anything in here. One of the scripts that I have in the training directory will actually delete files from here. But I wanted to point this out. So when you train, let's say you train and you let it run overnight. What you're going to notice is that your disk space is going to fill up significantly. Depending on the size of your disk, your hard disk, it's going to get pretty full. And so a lot of the files are going to be in this robo directory here. So just be aware that you probably want to have 100 to 150 or so gigs of free space before you just let this thing run overnight, because otherwise you're going to run out of disk space, and you're going to run into system errors. Then everything's going to crash, and you're going to have some problems. So, but I wanted to point out the directory just so you guys are aware. Okay, so back in the home directory here, let's see. What else did I want to point out? So I mentioned at the beginning that there's this DeepRacer log analysis tool that Amazon built. And one of the community members, Tomas, and he extended it, and he wrote a blog article about it, and you can get to it on the DeepRacer League. So it's under Racing Tips. And the guy, he goes by the name, the call name Breadcentric. And so you can look up his detailed explanation of how you can use his tools here. But I included that in this package because what I wanted to do is I wanted to give you an easy way to get started with actually doing doing log analysis yourself. So in the scripts directory in the log analysis, if you go into that and you hit start, what I've done is I've created a Docker container, and it's basically just got like a machine learning environment set up with Jupyter Lab. And when this thing starts up, you're going to see this output here. And what you want to do is you want to copy this and open up a browser tab. Go to localhost. And let's see. And then once you do that, once you paste in that URL, it's going to actually open up the web server on the container. And then you can see, or you can get to all of the files that are part of that particular container. So this is Tomas's project, and in here there's a particular notebook that I always use when I do training, and I come in here, and if you just run through kind of the first few cells within this notebook, it'll load the dependencies, and you can see what tracks are available. If you want to, let's say for instance, we switched to the China track. What you'd want to do is you'd want to set the track that you're using for training to you'd want to set that in this cell here. So that way when you're evaluating your logs that are output from the training process, it's going to do so in the context of this China or the track that you're using for training. So once you go through, you can come through here and once you go through those initial cells, you can come through. You can actually download your logs from CloudWatch once you do the evaluations. But what I normally do is I'll come into the logs directory. I'll go into the root directory. Then I think it's under data log. Where is it? There it is. Okay. So under the root directory, there's a logs directory, and then this is where the actual log files are going to be output to. And so you want to copy the name here, and this probably isn't how Tomas intended it to be used, but this is normally what I do if I want to actually evaluate the logs. So I'll come in here and I'll enter this file name, and I don't need to download it. So you can, like I said, you can find instructions on his blog post about how to use all this, but I'll come in here and didn't like the format here. Let's see. There it is. Okay. So I'll come in here, and then once you get the log file loaded, then you can basically just click through a bunch of times, and then once I don't have much data in here, so it's giving me errors. But once data starts flowing into these logs, you can go through and you'll actually start to see really good log output, and everything will get graphed, and you'll be able to look at completion times and reward values versus times, and you can really start to dig into the log. So he's done a great job with analyzing the logs that get output from DeepRacer. There's a ton of cool stuff that you can do with it. Really, this is if you want to get good at DeepRacer, this is really what you got to get good at, because all this data is in the logs, and that's really how you're going to improve your times. Okay, so anyway, that's the log analysis project, and this is going to stay running. So this script basically just gets the Jupyter Notebook container up and running, and you could just leave this running the whole time. You don't have to shut it down in between if you don't want to. So I'm going to open up a new tab here, and then we'll go back into training. And there's a couple more files in here that I wanted to point out. For instance, once you stop training, let's say you want to stop training, update your reward function, update your model metadata, and then go through and start training again with a new or with the previous model. What you need to do is once you stop training, you're going to want to come back in here into this RL DeepRacer Coach RoboMaker file and open that up. Come down into this hyperparameter section here, and then uncomment these two lines here. Make sure you got a comma there so that the syntax is correct. And what this is going to do, this is basically going to say, I want to start training from the RL DeepRacer pre-trained directory inside of the Minio directory, which we looked at earlier, which is one of the volumes that gets mounted in Docker. So doing that will allow you to take a model and a pre-trained model and start from there. And you also may want to possibly update some of the hyperparameters in here. I'm not going to get into what these hyperparameters are for. You can check the AWS documentation for that. There's really good tutorials on explaining what all these mean. So I'm not going to waste your time on going over that stuff now. Okay, so but in the scripts directory inside of training, once you stop training, if you want to start training from a previous model or from the model that you just trained from, what you're going to need to do, there's a two-step process you have to go through. There's this set last run to pre-trained, and I'll open this up real quick. What this is doing is it's basically removing the pre-trained directory if it's already there, because you might do this multiple times. You might train and then you want to clone that model and then train, keep training. So we're going to remove the pre-trained directory if it's already there, and then we're just going to take this RL DeepRacer SageMaker directory, which we looked at earlier, which is where all the model files are going to go, and we're going to rename that to RL DeepRacer pre-trained. So we're just renaming it to the one we just deleted, and what that's doing is it's just making it so that this directory is pointing to the model that we just came from, and so it's going to be our new starting point basically. So once you do that, then what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to run this delete last run script. And you're going to have to run sudo to do this because it's actually deleting a number of things. And this is going to, let's say you run this training overnight and you accumulate 150 gigabytes of just training snapshot data. This is basically going to clear all that out so that you're starting with only the last snapshotted model in your training process. So you have to run sudo to run this script. And it's going to go through and it's going to delete all of the previous training runs, files and directories that you want to get rid of so you can start training again. So once you do that, you're ready to start training again. So if you can just run start again, of course, once you've updated your reward function if you want to, or your model metadata or the hyperparameter. So if you want to update any of those things, make sure you do that before you run start. It's going to start up again. It's going to take that pre-trained model, it's going to load it into the new training environment, and then it's going to start from there. So hopefully, over time, you can see your model start to progress. So like I said, usually what I'll do is I'll start slow. I'll get a model trained, make sure that it can get around the laps, or start making laps, and then I'll start to increase the hyperparameter, the action space speeds and things like that. And then, I'll stop training, set the previous one to pre-train, delete the last training run, and then from there what you do is update your reward function if you need to, or action space, things like that, and then start training again. Once you're happy with your model, once your model is basically getting around consecutively, what you want to do then is you actually want to upload your model to DeepRacer. And then you can run it through the evaluation process. So in order to do that, what you want to do is you want to go in and make sure that you have a model already. And let me go ahead and get that up here quick. So you want to make sure that you've trained a model already. And let me log in AWS so I can show you what I'm talking about here. You're basically making a model that you're going to throw away. So you want to come into DeepRacer, create a model, start training. Once you've set everything up in here, start training. Doesn't matter really, what your action space or reward function or any of that stuff is. Just start training. Once it starts, you're going to stop training. And what that's going to do is that's going to create all the infrastructure, namely the S3 bucket, where your model is going to get uploaded to, and that's where you can submit your model to the virtual league. So right now I just have this single model in AWS. What I can do is I can click on this and I can go into submit to virtual race, and then hit submit, and it's going to go ahead and submit it to the virtual race to get evaluated and see how I do. Once you've created your initial model, what you want to do is you want to go in there and look at the simulation job and go to the, where is it? Simulation application. And there's a bunch of variables in here. There's a model S3 bucket and a model S3 prefix. You're going to need these two values because what you're going to do is you're going to use the upload script in the training directory. And we're going to come in here and upload. And we're going to replace this here with the bucket name right here. And then we're going to replace the prefix with the prefix right here. Now, the other thing you'll need to do is make sure that you have the AWS CLI installed. So the AWS CLI is just a command line utility that you can use to interact with AWS programmatically. And you need that because you need to make sure that you have the S3 so that you can connect to S3. So if you don't have the CLI installed, it's part of the prerequisites to installing this particular repo. But you can come to the AWS, just Google AWS CLI, and the easiest way to install is using pip command. You're gonna have to configure your account credentials when you do that, so that way you can access AWS through the command line. But it's pretty easy to do. It's pretty straightforward. If you get stuck, just Google it and you should be able to find out, or should be able to get help. All right, so once you've replaced these values, then you can come to the terminal here in your training directory, and you can just call upload snapshot. And by default, what this is going to do, this is going to find the latest checkpoint that was saved by SageMaker, and this is going to upload that. Now, let's say you went through your log analysis and you determined, well, I was doing really, really well, and then all of a sudden training kind of fell off and it started to get worse. What you can do is you can actually pick a specific checkpoint and upload that instead. So what this command will do is it also takes an optional checkpoint flag, and you can just give it the number. So normally what you'll do is you'll use this DeepRacer log analysis tool, and you'll come in here and you'll determine which checkpoint you want to upload to AWS, and you'll just pass that in as a integer into this particular command. So let's say the 78th checkpoint was the best one, and that's the one that you want to submit to the leaderboard. You can run that, and what it'll do is it'll go find all the files that it needs to upload to S3. It'll bundle them up, and then it'll actually zip them up and just keep them in this local directory. So if for whatever reason you needed to get back to it, you could always do that. Okay, so let's see, that's the set last run to pre-trained, upload snapshot. Those are really kind of the main scripts that you'll need: is start, stop, delete last, set last run to pre-train, and upload. This backup training run, what this does, this just does kind of what this does what the upload one does, except it just backs up the last training run directory to a directory that you choose. So I don't really use this one. I was using this for development, but you can probably ignore it. Feel free to look at it and see if it's something that you want to use, but anyway. Okay, so finally, there's also an evaluation directory. So you can, just like in the console, you can evaluate your training run. And all you have to do in here is just come in and, you can start and stop. It's going to use your last training run, last snapshot of your previous training run to actually evaluate to see how it does. All this does just basically sets up the whole environment, runs 5 laps or tries to do 5 laps, and then depending on how that does, you'll get some new log data output. I don't find it super useful, only because I'm not, usually what I'm doing is I'm just doing the training, evaluating the training using the log analysis tools, and then based on that, I'll upload my particular checkpoint. So feel free to use this. It works, but like I said, I don't particularly use it normally. I just go from the training directly. So I think that covers it. So the hopefully this gives you guys a good overview of how to use these tools. If you guys get stuck, or if you have comments or questions, or if there's problems or whatever, feel free to drop a note in the text below, or in the below the video, and or feel free to open up an issue on GitHub, and I'll try to resolve it as once I can find time to get to it. If you like this video, if it helped you out, please subscribe, like the video. Yeah, and good luck racing.